There are rules the modern world is built on. Rules so fundamental that we assume they can never be broken. One of them is this: NATO allies do not threaten each other. And yet, here we are. The White House has confirmed that the United States is discussing options to acquire Greenland. Not just diplomacy, not just pressure, but even the use of military force. Let that sink in. Greenland is a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark, a fellow NATO member. And suddenly, the question is no longer about ice or territory. It's about whether power now outweighs law. Whether alliances still mean what we think they mean. I've watched the international order evolve for decades. What alarms me is not ambition, but normalization. When leaders speak of force as just another option, if you want to understand why this moment matters far beyond Greenland, stay with me. Because before we talk about consequences, we must first define the problem itself. At the center of this story is a simple but unsettling shift in how problems are being defined. The United States is no longer talking about Greenland as a partner or even as a negotiation. It is talking about it as an objective, a place that is needed, a territory framed through the language of security, not consent. This matters because Greenland is not an abstract space on a map. It is a semi-autonomous region within Denmark, governed by international law, protected by treaties, and embedded in NATO's collective system. Its defense and foreign policy remain Danish responsibilities, while its people hold a distinct identity and political voice. And yet, senior figures in Washington now describe Greenland as something that should belong to the United States. They argue that because America carries the greatest military burden in NATO, it has a unique right to decide what security requires in the Arctic. This is where the problem sharpens. When security is defined unilaterally, law becomes secondary, alliances become conditional, and power begins to speak louder than rules. To understand how we reach this point, we have to look backward at history, cycles, and the Arctic itself. To understand why Greenland has returned to the center of global politics, we need to step back far beyond today's headlines. The Arctic has always been a frontier, remote, frozen, and strategically dormant. But history teaches us a pattern. Regions once ignored become contested the moment technology and climate change make them accessible. That moment has arrived. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping routes emerge, shorter paths between Europe, Asia, and North America. At the same time, the region holds untapped resources and unmatched strategic positioning for missile defense, surveillance, and power projection. During the Cold War, Greenland already mattered. The United States built military infrastructure there, not as an owner, but as an ally operating within agreed rules. Denmark remained sovereign. NATO remained intact. Power was balanced by consent. What has changed is not geography, but the cycle of competition. Russia and China are now openly increasing their Arctic presence. And in periods of rising great power rivalry, strategic anxiety tends to override restraint. The Arctic shifts from shared space to contested arena. That historical pattern helps explain today's language, but it does not yet explain today's escalation. Because history also shows us what happens when fear replaces trust. And that leads us to the first real rupture. The first rupture did not come quietly. It came as a signal in the wake of a US military operation in Venezuela, where elite American forces seized a sitting president and flew him to New York. The idea of force suddenly felt less hypothetical. It was no longer history. It was precedent. Then came the imagery. A map of Greenland, colored in the American flag. One word attached: soon. It was posted casually, almost playfully. But in geopolitics, symbols matter. They prepare minds before actions. They normalize what once seemed unthinkable. Within hours, European leaders reacted. Denmark's Prime Minister warned that any attack on Greenland would spell the end of NATO itself. Soon after, 6 major European allies issued a rare joint statement: clear, direct, unambiguous. Greenland belongs to its people. Borders matter. Sovereignty is not optional. This was no longer a debate about strategy, it was a crisis of principles. When allies feel compelled to publicly defend each other from within the alliance, something fundamental has cracked. And once that crack appears, it rarely stays contained, because beneath this moment lies a deeper system, one that quietly shapes how power now moves. What we are really witnessing is not a dispute over Greenland. It is the exposure of a hidden mechanism inside the international system. For decades, the global order rested on a balance between power and rules. The United States was the strongest actor, but it chose to embed its power inside alliances, laws, and institutions. NATO worked not because America was dominant, but because America accepted limits. That balance is now shifting. When senior US officials say that utilizing the military is always an option, they are not announcing a plan. They are changing the frame. Force is no longer a last resort. It becomes a background assumption. This is how systems evolve. Not through sudden collapse, but through language, through repetition, through normalization. If power defines security, then consent becomes irrelevant. If America is the power of NATO, as its leaders now argue, then smaller allies become dependents, not partners. And once that logic is accepted, it does not stop at Greenland. This mechanism, security defined by dominance, creates a world where rules apply selectively, where strength determines legitimacy. That is the system quietly emerging beneath the headlines. And when such systems surface, they rarely remain theoretical for long, because systems eventually touch real lives. The second escalation arrives not as an explosion, but as a tightening grip. When asked directly whether the United States would rule out using force to annex Greenland, the answer was striking in its calmness. No denial, no reassurance, just confidence. Nobody's going to fight the US over the future of Greenland. That sentence matters because it reveals a calculation that goes beyond strategy. It assumes acquiescence. It assumes silence. It assumes that overwhelming power makes resistance irrelevant. Even inside Washington, this logic is echoed institutionally. The Defense Department confirms it has contingency plans for any scenario, not because action is imminent, but because planning itself signals plausibility. And this is where tension peaks. Europe is forced into an impossible position to challenge the US risks shattering NATO, to remain quiet risks accepting a precedent that no ally is truly safe. A military alliance designed to deter external threats now faces an internal stress test. This is no longer about intent. It is about trajectory. Once force is treated as a reasonable option among allies, deterrence turns inward, trust erodes, and the system begins to bend under its own weight. But systems do not break in conference rooms. They break when they reach ordinary people. And that is where this story turns next. For the people of Greenland, this is not theory. It is fear made personal. You are not a chess piece on a strategic board. You are a population of 57,000 people with a language, a history, and a name for your land, Kalalit Nunad, the land of the Greenlandic people. And yet, you listen as powerful leaders speak about your home as if it were an asset, a necessity, something to be claimed. One young Inuit man described it as terrifying, not because of tanks or ships, but because of tone, the laughter, the casual way sovereignty is dismissed, the sudden realization that international law may not protect you after all. You start asking questions no citizen of a peaceful democracy should have to ask. Will our leaders be targeted? Will our autonomy survive? Could invasion be possible? This is how geopolitical shifts are felt, first as unease, then as dread. If you believe global politics is abstract, this is your reminder that it never is. It always reaches real lives. If this story matters to you, stay engaged, share it, think about it, because what happens to small places today often defines the rules that govern all of us tomorrow. And from Greenland, the shockwaves are already moving outward. What begins in Greenland does not stay in Greenland, because the Arctic is no longer a remote frontier. It is becoming a central artery of global power. As ice melts, new shipping routes shorten distances between continents. Control of these routes means control of trade, data cables, military mobility, and surveillance. That is why Russia has expanded its Arctic military footprint. That is why China calls itself a near-Arctic state. And that is why the United States now speaks of Greenland not as a partner, but as a necessity. But here is the global consequence. If the US asserts the right to reshape borders for security reasons, others will follow the logic even if they lack the power. International law weakens, not when it is violated by rivals, but when it is bypassed by its architects. Europe understands this danger. That is why leaders rallied so quickly behind Denmark, not just to defend Greenland, but to defend a principle. Borders cannot be rewritten by pressure alone. Once that principle erodes, disputes multiply. From Eastern Europe to the South China Sea, the precedent travels fast. Greenland may be small, but the message it sends is enormous. And from that message, the future begins to take shape. When systems reach moments like this, the future rarely unfolds in a straight line. Instead, it branches. From where we stand today, I see three possible paths ahead. The first is restraint. In this scenario, pressure gives way to diplomacy. The United States recalibrates its language. NATO reasserts collective decision-making. Greenland's status is reaffirmed through law and consent. Security is pursued, but within the system that has preserved peace for decades. This path stabilizes the Arctic, but it requires humility from power. The second path is ambiguity. The rhetoric remains. Military options stay on the table. Nothing happens immediately, but trust continues to erode. Allies grow cautious. Smaller states hedge. The system survives, but thinner, weaker, more transactional. The third path is rupture. Force, or the credible threat of it, becomes normalized among allies. Borders become negotiable. Power replaces principle. In this world, security becomes zero-sum, and instability spreads outward from every precedent set. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems usually drift toward the path that demands the least resistance, which is why what happens next matters so deeply, because the final outcome will not be decided by geography but by choices. And that brings us to the insight we cannot avoid. This is not a story about Greenland alone. It is a story about what kind of world you are going to live in. For decades, the international order rested on a fragile but powerful idea, that strength should be restrained by rules, and that alliances mattered more than ambition. That idea was never perfect, but it worked well enough to prevent chaos. What unsettles me is not that power is being asserted. Power always is. What unsettles me is how casually limits are now discussed away. When military force becomes just another option in conversations between allies, something essential is lost. Trust, predictability, the sense that small nations are protected, not exposed. Greenland's people have been clear. Europe has been clear. International law is clear. The only uncertainty lies in whether restraint still carries weight in an age of raw competition. And this is where you come in. Because global orders do not collapse overnight. They erode when citizens stop paying attention, when language hardens without challenge, when precedents pass unnoticed. If this analysis helped you see the system behind the headline, share it. Stay curious, stay critical. Because the future of power is being negotiated right now, often quietly, sometimes openly. And this is only the beginning of that conversation.